Slavery was an institution that was very much part of the normal society in the old world. And in fact, it laid the groundwork for much of the New World slavery, which became the apex and the most advanced form of slavery that has ever existed. But Old World slavery, it did have some key differences, which distinguished it from its New World younger sister. And today we're going to go over some of those differences, and we're going to get a brief familiarity with the Old World system of slavery to find out why it was used and how it functioned as an institution. And so for us to do that, we're going to be reading from this book here. It's called Race in North America by social anthropologist Dr. Audrey Smedely. And so let's go in here and turn to page 127, where it says this. Slavery, in its fundamental sense, originated in societies that were essentially kinship-based. That is, in which kinship structures, institutions, values, beliefs, and ideology were dominant forces in the social system. And so what does she mean by kinship-based? That's referring to a social structure that is centered around the family unit, where you have property rights, marriages, wealth, political roles, and so forth that are dependent upon family ties. And so Dr. Smedley is starting out saying that slavery had its foundation within these kinship-based societies. And she's going to explain how and why as we keep reading. In such societies, the chief organizing principle were those of kinship. It was the foundation not only of people's identity, but of their social, political, economic, and ritual status in society and their relationships to others. This was true even in the civil societies of Rome and Greece, where social identity came nearest to the concept of citizenship, a form of identity essential to modern nation states and viewed as a contractual relationship between the state and the individual, meaning the state offers certain rights to the citizen, and in return the citizen has certain duties and responsibility to the state. This is part of the contract, and this, just like any other social structure, is an idea or concept first that lays the blueprint for human society. A state or a citizen doesn't exist in the natural world. These are both ideas that create a framework for humans to operate within. That's why she described it as the concept of citizenship. And the ability to create these complex concepts is one function that separates the human from the rest of the animal kingdom. Now, these animals, they may have some ability to do this to some degree as well, but not nearly as advanced as the human can, who can create concepts like nation states, citizens, and kinship societies. But let's keep going. The paterfamilias was the head of the Roman lineage or family. Family members derived their social status, property, and identity, and thus a large element of their citizenship from their relationship to him. Such was the power and responsibility of the pater that he had right to life and death decisions about his own children. In all such societies, the kin group, whether it was a large aggregate encompassing thousands or a small lineage of 10 or 20 persons, was the sine qua non, or the absolutely essential part of the socio-political system. Without a kin group to support and fortify him, a man was essentially a non-entity. So because of the way the society was structured, if a person didn't belong to a kin group, then they were basically cut off from society. So belonging to a kin group appears to have been a very necessary part of life. Let's keep reading. Even the poorest peasants were enmeshed in a complex of relationships, of which the vortex was the kin groups that socialized them, told them who they were, provided guidelines and sanctions for their behavior, and determined the course of their future lives. Genealogical ties, regardless of their biological accuracy, were a network of links that bound individuals, most importantly men, to one another and specified their rights, privileges, powers, immunities, and obligations. In the urban city-states of the ancient world and in kingdoms and chiefdoms throughout history, kinship underscored the political dual relationships among peoples and groups. So in the ancient world, a person's family ties played a major role in the political and legal areas. And this was the idea that was understood and accepted by most people during that time. Let's keep reading. The elements of kinship as the universally recognized mechanisms by which the most significant political relationships were established and maintained has been well established by anthropologists. All civil societies before the rise of the modern nation state of the industrial world were in many ways elaborations on the principles of kinship. It is important to establish this point early because slavery is best comprehended minimally as a non-kinship relationship, institutionalized in society in which kinship provided the central principles of organization, particularly at the community or local level. As Paul Bohannon has observed, slaves are essentially kinless people. Indeed, he claims, the institution of slavery itself is anti-kin. And in the book West Africa by historian Dr. Eugene Mendoza, he talks about how one could lose kinship status in two ways. One, becoming a witch, or two, becoming a slave. And he also states in there that a slave could regain kinship after some time. But these were some of the ideas that these older societies were based upon. Let's keep going. Patterson has likened this condition to one of social death. We will probably never know exactly when and where slavery arose as a new concept of human relationships. Evidence indicates, however, that it came about only after the establishment of a mature farming way of life, with large, stable populations and an emphasis on the aggregation of property and wealth. Such societies had already evolved groups and statuses that were unequal in their command over goods and services and in the degree of social political power they could exercise. By the time of the first records on slavery, there were already small city-states with stratified social systems incorporating many specialists such as farmers, herders, fishermen, traders, metal workers, builders, carpenters, butchers, priests, administrators, bureaucrats, and military men. Differences in economic functions had given rise to social distinctions and to the further tendency to rank these different occupations and positions. Moreover, power and privilege had become politically concentrated in the hands of specific functionaries. Slavery arose, then, in inegalitarian societies in which the concept of one man having power over others was already developed. And what was it? A concept, first and foremost, that one man is supposed to have power over all the others. And a society structured in this manner has the potential to be very dangerous. Why? Because when someone gets into position of power and they express the human destructive quality and traits, and there's no one else in power to check that person, then we can see how things can get totally out of hand, right? And this is one of the reasons why many human societies have moved away from this type of social concept. But she's saying that slavery arose from this type of system. Let's keep going. Another characteristic of these societies was that some form of compulsory labor was also recognized. We know from many anthropological studies that in developed chiefdoms, an early state of centralized governance, community members were required to allocate a portion of their labor or produce to the chief, as well as to his retinue and household. Young men, for example, who constituted the members of age-grade organizations, age sets, were required to clear land, footpaths, and roads, build bridges, erect granaries and other semi-public buildings, and serve in the armed forces. This was customary and expected, and young men had few or no options for avoiding such service. Other types of what we would call coerced labor have also been documented. What we should bear in mind when we look for comparative materials, however, is that these were societies in which there was no wage labor as we know it. Wage labor is a phenomenon that developed in early capitalism. And so wage labor is selling one's labor for payment in return, which is stemming from capitalism, which is an economic system where private people and businesses control the production of goods and services. And this system is competition based and is driven by profits. And so to be competitive in this system, you have to develop products, services, and skills that are in demand. And so she's saying that these earlier societies were not based off of wage labor and capitalism. They were functioning based off of other ideas. Let's keep going. All labor, voluntary or compulsory, was invariably compensated through the reciprocal process inherent in pre-industrial economic systems where kinship values prevailed. Trade was the source of much of the wealth and the basis of political development of most ancient kingdoms. As various groups came into greater competition for trade, strategic resources, and raw materials, many also came into open conflict. And so the human trait of greed began to manifest within some of these people. And here's what happened next. Hostilities led to small and large-scale battles, and eventually there came a time when one of the consequences of such warfare was conquest, the takeover of whole communities and the subjugation of their people. Here we go. It was without doubt in answer to the problem of what to do with these foreigners that slavery developed. It's getting spicy. Here we go. The first recorded instances of slavery represented the slaves as products, booty of war, and warfare was to remain throughout much of human history a major source of slaves. Slavery was an alternative to extermination, meaning they can get out there and work the field or they can be put to death. Here we go. Slave men and women could be put to productive work, augmenting the resources and wealth of their masters. Those with special skills were more valuable than simple laborers. Women could be used as domestic workers, prostitutes, or childbearers, creating more workers for their masters. Both domestic and industrial enterprises benefited from this unpaid labor, who needed only to be fed and clothed with minimal material comforts, which they themselves often had to produce. And again, who was doing this? Just about every society worthy of the name. They were all involved. It was a normal part of the reality that they faced at that time. People all the way from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Nubia, Greece, Rome, China, and many, many more were involved in this institution, right? Everyone at some time had people who were enslaved, and everyone at a different time had people who did their fair share of owning the slaves. And these are all documented, and we can read about these in a few books. One of them called the Historical Encyclopedia of World Slavery, 2 volumes, and a book called Chronology of World Slavery. All these written by historian Dr. Junius Rodriguez. And in there you can see that slavery was everywhere. Here we go. Slaves thus liberated free men and women from productive labor. They also became a source of prestige to the wealthy and powerful. Owning slaves was a symbol of status and affluence, a form of conspicuous consumption. And so what is a status symbol for many Americans today? Career, big house, luxury cars. So if someone has a high-paying job with a big house and a fancy car, then much of the society is going to perceive them in some sense to have some type of status. In the old world, the status symbol included the slave. You see those people down the street, man, they got about 10 or 15 slaves at their house. We want to be like them someday, right? Completely different set of ideas that were controlling their reality, a completely different world they lived in, a completely different thought pattern that they had than what most of us have today. Let's keep going. Several other factors facilitated the conquering society's treatment of alien human beings as objects, property, and beasts of burden. First of all, from the earliest settled Neolithic farming way of life some 10 to 12,000 years ago, when defined groups of people became associated with demarcated or divided plots of land, property relationships factored into all human relationships. In such societies, groups of people formed by kinship principles came to be identified with property, and specific kinds and pieces of property became symbols of social relationships among and between individuals and groups. In probably all societies, some aspects of persons have been interpreted as being exchangeable for some form of property. Bride wealth is a recognition of the fact that women have value as wives. Prostitution is an ancient institution that focuses on a woman's sexuality as an asset, exchangeable for some other form of property. Children were, and still are, frequently pawned, sold, and adopted via the exchange of some valued good. And of course, wage labor is a prime example of the exchangeability of certain facets of human beings, their time, skill, talents, abilities, strength, senses, and attention for property. Yet the differences are clear. Under most forms of slavery, the total person becomes a commodity, and the exchange is mostly involuntary and often permanent. Second, in kinship-based societies, particularly where the kin group is a corporate estate-owning entity, an ethos already exists expressing the concept that both individuals and groups have rights in person over their members and one another. And so what does that mean? This means that individuals belonging to the kin group and the group itself through its representative or headman can make demands of its members and can dispose of them according to their judgment of what is best for the group. This is manifest in the high degree of control and power that kin groups exercise over members' behavior in such transactions as the arranging of marriages, the adoption, sale, or pawning of children, the allocation of labor and resources among members, and the imposing of penalties for wrongdoings. The group may also make demands for expenses accompanying all rites of passage, birth, puberty, ceremonies, marriages, and death, and other ritual occasions. Some of these rights are exchangeable, as in very local marriages, in which men of one kin group relinquish certain rights over their daughters or sisters, giving away the bride to another kin group. In most societies, before the imposition of state laws protecting the individual, kin groups had the sole power of life and death over their members. Slavery evolved, then, in traditional societies, where the concept of rights in or over persons was part of a nexus of understanding, customs, and beliefs about human relationships. And so slavery evolved within a particular setting and with people who had a culture and belief patterns that allowed for its expression. Let's continue. But the notion of power and rights over others clearly forms the backdrop for the transformation that gave rise to slavery. As strangers, the conquered aliens had no kinship ties among the conquering group, and thus they were not part of the ongoing social system. As enemies who were no longer a threat and no longer free to pursue their old way of life, captive persons were without any viable position or status in their new setting, and their new setting was as conquered people with no kinship ties. Their very existence, as Patterson 1982 has noted, was an option to physical death, right? You either go into the pit of slavery or you bite the dust. Here we go. Beyond normal reproduction, one of the chief ways of enlarging one's kinship unit was to incorporate other individuals through adoption and or marriage. This process was particularly common in those societies in which there were few slaves, in which the economy could not sustain or had no need for slave labor, or in which there were slaves with unusual talents or skills. Throughout Africa, in regions where traditional slavery was practiced, there is considerable evidence that enslaved persons were frequently absorbed into the kin group of their conquerors. In many societies, including the ancient Mediterranean states and the Muslim world, such adoptions became an important device for freeing slaves. Once kinship had been created, obviously an individual's slave status ceased to exist. So we can see that there was some wiggle room in some of these earlier forms of slavery, where one did have the opportunity to see freedom one day. Let's keep reading. In a different context, where agricultural and manufacturing activities could be enhanced with additional labor, slavery was institutionalized as pure manpower, and there grew a demand for slave labor on farms and plantations, in mines, manufacturing industries, and commerce, as well as in domestic settings. Because warfare and conquest are unpredictable and unreliable ways of obtaining slaves, other mechanisms appeared to fill the demand. Let's find out what these other mechanisms were. Slave raiding and trading are described in the early literature of the Mediterranean and Babylonian peoples. And what is slave raiding? That's the practice of capturing people for the purpose of selling them as slaves. The slave raiders often looked for the most vulnerable and easy to capture people to prey on. So with the least resistance, they could capture those people, take them off far away to be sold to labor camps. And people from many different backgrounds were doing this for thousands of years. Here we go. Phoenicians and Greeks raided for slaves along the Mediterranean coast and inland as far as the Danube River and the coast of the Black Sea. In Asia Minor, where some of the largest trading centers developed, records show that Syrians, Germans, Thracians, Greeks, Jews, Egyptians, Ethiopians, Arabians, Persians, Spaniards, and the North African peoples were sold in the slave marts. All types of people being sold like hotcakes, right? Going into the bottomless pit of the slave market. Let's keep reading. In Roman times, the Greek islands were a favored source of slaves, but many came from what is now Spain, France, Germany, and the British Isles. Yep, they were slaves too, and this is why it's important to put the institution of slavery in its full, broader context, so we can gain insight on to what it was about, why it existed, who was doing it, who was a victim of it, right? And we can also gain insight on the evolution of the human consciousness as we can see it unfold over time. Let's keep going. The Germans raided their neighbors and the peoples around the Black Sea to obtain captives for Muslim markets. Once the trade in slaves had been established, It became an end in itself as a source of wealth for merchants. Slavery subsequently became a very flexible institution which could be molded to fit many kinds of social exigencies. As such, it was perceived as essential and necessary, and especially in the mind of the people who were getting wealthy from it. There were many poor but free men, for example, who could barely eke out a living in farmlands and towns. So it soon became a custom for men who had become impoverished to sell themselves or their children into slavery. Men would voluntarily enter into servitude for a period of time to work off their debts, after which they or their family members would regain their freedom. Debt slavery became quite common and was widely recognized as an accepted variant of slavery. This is one of those things that's still happening today in some areas in the world. I saw an entire documentary that showed children as young as 5 years old working alongside their parents to pay off these family debts, right? They were working in the blazing hot sun making these mud bricks, right? This was in Nepal in Southeast Asia, located between India and China. And so these people were living on the work site and they were basically just working all day. Some of these people were well into their 70s and have been making bricks for decades, right? It can get wild out here, some of these realities. Let's keep going. In addition, slavery as punishment for crimes committed by free men evolved as a way of dealing with miscreants. Individuals were sometimes sentenced to enslavement for a given period of time or for life and might be sold away to a foreign land as an extreme form of punishment. From their beginnings, the Roman, Catholic, and Byzantine churches were major slave-owning institutions, as has been their ancestral pre-Christian temples of the ancient world. They were also major forces for improving the condition of slaves, and they frequently manumitted their slaves, often with the purpose of incorporating them into the clergy, which is the religious leadership. Some high church officials, including a few popes, were descendants of slaves or were themselves born into the condition of slavery. There were state-owned slaves, who were often men of great training who kept the books, prepared documents, and wrote and even administered the laws. There were industrial slaves who worked in the mines, craft shops, and local factories. Domestic slaves, the largest category of all, were owned by individual families. Many ancient and medieval states employed slaves as part of their military forces. Slaves were even appointed as leaders of armed forces. Some of these military leaders achieved greatness through their own talents and were able to gain their freedom because of their exploits and success on the battlefield. Most of the ancient and medieval states depended to a greater or lesser extent on slave labor for some facet of their economic production and trade. Not only was slavery extensive in the Old World, but the slave trade continued throughout the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Black Sea until modern times. David Breon Davis points out that the great Mediterranean slave trade reached its peak in the 14th and 15th centuries. Christians enslaved Muslims, and Muslims in turn captured and enslaved Christians. Everybody was getting it in, as we can see. Davis tells us that Swedish merchants traded captive Russians down the Volga and Dnieper river valleys along with furs and wax. Merchants and nobles of medieval Russia saw the export of slaves as the principal source of wealth. Men from Genoa and Venice established slave trading posts in ports along the Black Sea where they did a thriving business. Tartars, Circassians, Armenians, Georgians, and Bulgarians flowed into the markets of Italy and Spain. At the height of the Muslim Empire, some of the caliphs of Baghdad, the political and religious center of the Islamic world from the 18th to the 13th centuries, were importing tens of thousands of slaves, many from Spain and a few even from the Far East. When sugar production was established on the islands in the eastern Mediterranean, a new impetus was given to the slave trade, and a new structuring of slaves on plantations took place, despite the fact that slavery was declining in Western Europe. Slavery was an institution that was not only widespread in the Old World, but was intertwined with virtually all aspects of culture: political, religious, economic, and social. Do you see how prevalent it was? This is what we have to understand. Owning slaves was just about as normal as people owning dogs today. It wasn't much for people to think about. It just was what it was. And because it was culturally, socially, politically, and religiously acceptable, then that's what made it right in the eyes of the people. Here we go. Just as in the Old Testament days, Slavery was recognized as a necessary, normal, and proper component of the social system. And when you study the Bible, you can't help but to notice how much they talk about slavery and bondage. And in fact, the prophet Isaiah, or more specifically, the people writing in the name of Isaiah, talk about God setting up the Israelites in their own land, right? And the Israelites taking possession of the nations and keeping them as servants and handmaids. And that's in Isaiah chapter 14. And so in the writers' minds, they saw people possessing other people as a necessary part of life. And they had no problem whatsoever with that idea. But let's keep going. There were those who condemned the immorality and brutality of slavery, but they did not question or object the legality of the institution. Meaning some people didn't want others treated harshly, but on the record, the institution of owning people itself was never questioned. And I'm sure that there are people who had those thoughts back then, that that system was unfitting for humans, but they didn't have an extensive number of tools like we have today to record those type of opinions, right? At least the vast majority of people didn't have that access. The elites were the people who had the knowledge and the capability of writing and reading. So it cannot be said with 100% certainty that nobody spoke against the institution itself. But the written records don't reflect that, right? They reflect a lack of that expression. Let's keep reading. Yet slavery was never considered a nice institution, even by those who believed it to be right and proper. The fundamental dilemma of slavery has frequently intruded into human consciousness, as evidenced by the fact that during the development, some felt the need to attempt to justify the institution. They were bothered by the disturbing reality of treating people as objects and took great pains to rationalize this paradox and make it acceptable to themselves and others. Early in the history of the Greek city-states, slaves were thought of as normal human beings who had had the misfortune of being taken into slavery. Later, the belief evolved that some occupations were only fit for slaves and that conquered peoples were suited only for servile tasks. Greek ethnocentrism depicted all alien peoples as barbarians, uncivilized and deficient in governing themselves. Like some English 2,000 years later, Greek apologists for slavery argued that the institution was just, legitimate, and proper, and that the Greek states should enslave barbarians and provide law and order throughout the Mediterranean world. In this context, it was the superiority of Greek institutions of government, not the biological superiority of the Greek people, that provided the rationale, meaning it was based on the system that they had set up, not being the white man as the English instituted later on. Let's keep going. In Rome, those persons who accepted the Latin language, customs, and laws ceased being barbarians and could ultimately be accepted as full citizens of the state. Much has been made of the fact that some Greek philosophers, notably Aristotle and Plato, formulated the argument that some individuals were natural slaves. But it is most important to realize that this categorization, though sometimes referring to specific ethnic groups, was a general statement about differences of personality and abilities among individuals. Specifically, what these philosophers thought was the power to reason. The distinction was applied to other Greeks as well as to non-Greeks. Independent of the attempts to rationalize slavery, and much more frequent in expression, were periodic efforts to improve the condition of slaves. Perhaps because it was viewed as part of the natural order of things, the morality of slavery was not widely questioned until the rise of anti-slavery sentiment in Western culture in the 18th century. No written record reflects the challenge to the institution itself until the Enlightenment period, which, interestingly enough, is around the same time where slavery reached its apex in the Western Hemisphere. And so Western culture, with this idea of freedom, was able to create this counter force to challenge the practice of slavery. But until that point, scholars are saying that there's no evidence to challenge this system of slavery. Let's continue. During the most oppressive periods, such as in Rome under the Republic several centuries before Christ, masters had tyrannical powers over their slaves. Slaves had no civil position and could be punished or even killed by their masters with impunity, meaning no consequence of the law. Industrial slaves working in mines received the harshest treatment of all. They were frequently beaten or worked to death and merely replaced by newer slaves who could be purchased cheaply. The sheer brutality of such conditions inspired some to apply pressure to ameliorate the slave's situation. But this was not just a reaction to the harshness of the treatment of slaves. Some people soon realized that slavery appeals to the most base, corrupting, and degrading of human inclinations. Both free people and slaves are brutalized under slavery, and each suffers a loss of freedom and human sensitivity and compassion. The unchecked power of slave owners sometimes led to unspeakable cruelty, and no one was exempt from the consequences. Other factors provided a dynamic social tension that periodically served to curtail or inhibit the abuse of slaves. Practical self-interest led slaveholders to moderate their behavior, if for no other reason than that one cannot get good work out of a skilled and intelligent person who is treated merely as a thing. Many slaves of Roman times, for example, were highly educated, well-trained Greeks and Egyptians. In many instances, the master soon recognized the superiority of the slave. This helped to account for the fact that in different areas and different circumstances, the treatment of slaves and other unfree labor varied enormously. The fact is that no matter how ruthless and brutal the practice of slavery in different periods may have been, inevitably, the slaveholders could not ignore the humanity of the slaves. But recognizing people as human beings is not tantamount to showing kindness and compassion. From the standpoint of contemporary moral values anchored in humanitarian ideals, all forms of slavery are tyrannical, brutal, and oppressive in that they deprive other human beings of their basic freedoms. That was not always the case. In the moral arena in which evaluations and judgments are made today differs greatly from that of antiquity. Which is true because we don't think the same in many of these areas as they did. And we also have a different conception of what is valuable and also what is moral. And so what they did was right in the eyes of the Lord for that time. And it also applies to us, what we're doing right now. And also later on for the other generations that come after us. Let's keep going. A variety of customs, habits, and conventions developed, affecting the sale and treatment of slaves and the relationships between slaves on the one hand and masters and other free persons on the other. Some of these soon became codified into bodies of laws, like those found in the codes of Hammurabi of Babylon 18 centuries before Christ. In societies without written literature, codes for managing slaves were part of a large oral repertoire of customs and traditions that were handed down from one generation to the next and maintained as general guidelines for behavior. These ancient bodies of laws, customs, legal precedents, and traditions recognized the paradox of people being defined as things. Lawmakers, writers, and philosophers grappled with the finer points of cases in which distinctions had to be drawn between the slaves as property and the slave as human. One distinction, expressed in the law codes from Augustinian times to those of Justinian, was that between ius gentium, law common to all people, and ius naturae, natural law. The law of nature, some Romans argued, declared that there are natural rights inherent in mankind that cannot be denied under slavery. According to the law of nature, every man is an equal. Slave codes, customs, and actual practices reflected the degree to which society were willing to give cognizance and priority to the human rights of slaves. Of significance for this study is the fact that prior to the 18th century, there appears to have been no society that categorically denied the humanity of slaves in law and social beliefs, even when their treatment appeared most brutal. That is, no society felt the need to rationalize slavery by denying that slaves were fully human. Virtually all societies viewed them as unfortunate, inferior, and powerless, although their status varied widely. Peoples of all physical variations and ethnic groups have been subject to enslavement since ancient times. And like I said, everyone has made the journey down into the pit, all throughout history in various places and in various times. The entire world was a slave. Now, they weren't mentally enslaved like what happened to the Negro, but they were definitely in chains out there working in the field in the blazing hot sun, right? Or at least to some degree similar. Let's keep going. The only restriction was the prohibition against enslaving one's co-religionists. Christians theoretically did not enslave other Christians, or Muslims other Muslims, a situation likely honored more in its breach than its observance. Certain codes of law had systematized and distilled many characteristics of old world slavery as they were manifested in Spain and Portugal. Las Siete Partidas, a body of legal and moral principles enacted in Castile in the 13th century, governed slavery in Spain, and like its predecessor, the Justinian Code, it placed restrictions on the behavior of both masters and slaves, decreed appropriate punishment for offenses, and specified the rights and entitlements of slaves. It provided, among other things, for the manumission or the freeing of slaves and the recognition of the rights of slaves to marry, earn wages, have instruction in religion, and be protected and represented in courts of law. The continuity of slavery in the Western Mediterranean meant that the institution's customs, laws, practices, beliefs, and habits were already established precedents for the New World conquerors. Those precedents formed part of the cultural knowledge that was transmitted to the New World by the conquistadors and others. And that's the linkage between the Old World and the New World. It's not like the Europeans just popped up one day and say, you know what? We want to start just putting people in chains. That's not how it went. What they were doing was continuing an already well-established practice that they took from the 2.0 version and upgraded it to the 9.0 version, right? But more important for us to understand is that this was a continuous link, right? That transitioned from the Old World system to what we call the New World. Let's keep reading. Elements of Las Siete Partidas were carried across the Atlantic and instituted in the New World colonies under the supervision and sanctions of the Crown and the Church. They were designed to serve as guidelines for the legal regulation of slavery among both indigenous peoples and later imported ones. However, historians such as Magnus Morner, Colin Palmer, and Leslie Rout Jr. have warned that strict supervision of the relationships between masters and slaves in the New World context could hardly have been very efficient, and adherence to Las Siete Partidas was most likely only minimal in many areas. And I bet it was, because the Europeans who had came over here, they had lost their mind and they had lost all form of self-control, and greed had taken over them. And of course, all of these man-made laws, they threw them out the window. Let's keep going. They suggest that local laws enacted to deal with particular circumstances often superseded or contradicted the laws of the crown or colonial governments. Nevertheless, Las Siete Partidas and the Cedulas, or decrees issued by the monarchy and backed by the Catholic Church, provided standards and guidelines for slave-master relationships as reflected in the Old World customs. If nothing else, they were reminders of the human personality and inviolable rights of the slaves, and undoubtedly protected them in many instances from excessive brutality and abuse, which was one of the differences between the New World slavery, which in the New World slavery, they created many ideas to justify the abuse and the destruction of many of the enslaved subjects. And so the Old World, they no doubt dealt much in slavery. That was a normal institution and part of everyday life, right? Owning people. But they didn't conceptualize ideas to completely eradicate people's minds and mentally enslave people for generations upon generations, which was done in the New World, right? Advanced psychological concepts that were implemented into the system of slavery, right? Something that had never been done in the Old World, although the Old World was very brutal too, right? In the way that they physically dealt with people, right? And so the Old World and the New World slavery systems had their differences. And so hopefully you've gained some insight on this brief history of the Old World slavery, how it came about, a little bit of the history on it. And this is important to know because it gives us a broader view on the subject of slavery, and it also demonstrates the many-aspected nature of human beings who are capable of imagining some very interesting ideas to manifest and bring down into the physical world. You see? And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. Hopefully this has been helpful. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.